So, the global events which we have been describing in the previous slides caught South Africans by surprise, just as they did virtually everybody else in the world. But one particular organization that was caught by surprise was the South African Communist Party. And in 1989, shortly before the fall of the wall, the 7th Congress of the SACP was able to restate its faith that there were three main revolutionary contingents which would continue to support South Africans to find what it termed the path to power. And these three contingents were characterized as being the world socialist system, which at the time, of course, was in the process of unraveling, the national liberation movements in developing countries, which, as we've seen from our tour of Zambia, Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, were all facing serious problems and were many of them were about to transition to being multi-party democracies and to abandon Marxism-Leninism. And then the third area, the third contingent, was characterized as the working class movement in developed capitalist countries. Well as the other two categories, the working class movement itself was also in a process of decline. So this rapid collapse of the world socialist system and the effects, the combined effects of the continued conflict in neighboring states really actually served to erode the support for the South African struggle, and together succeeded in redrawing the balance of both global and regional forces. The document did, however, get one thing right. It stated that in the SACP's view, the situation in South Africa carried within it the seeds of a sudden transformation. In the liberation movement narrative, this sudden transformation was going to be achieved by means of an armed insurrection, a revolutionary capture of power, but in actual fact, the transformation, as we're all aware, came from a very different source, i.e. through a negotiated process, something which had not really been projected. So when we look back on this democratic transition in 1994 and the processes which led up to it, the role play that we have just been involved in, the Codesa process, it's clear that many contemporary narratives in South Africa view this negotiated transition as effectively a betrayal of the liberation struggle, and some have gone so far as to characterize it as a sellout by the previous generation of activists. However, I hope that the evidence that's been presented in this session shows how many of these accounts may simplify or at times completely ignore the complex history of the period that we have been reviewing. What is also really important to try and understand, which is fairly difficult from our vantage point in 2016, is just the level of violence that was in South African society in the early 1990s. This saw a sharp escalation in the period 1991 to 93, and this prompted the recognition by both the apartheid state and the liberation movements that South Africa was actually finding itself in a stalemate, a no-win situation. South Africa had a very powerful military, and although there had been successes coming as a result of the armed struggle and the strategy of People's War, which had rendered certain areas of the country virtually ungovernable, nobody was able to really predict that they could be the outright victor at any time in the future. So this violent situation is captured in two videos that two short clips that we're going to show now. The first is around the assassination of Chris Hani, and the second is a short clip which shows the RVAB's storming of the venue where the negotiations were being held in Kempton Park.
At the height of sensitive political negotiations for a democratic South Africa, and Chris Hani was at the center of these efforts.
The oppressed and working people long for peace. They long for an end to violence. They long for their freedom that has long been denied.
The 10th of April 1993 started out as any other Saturday in the Hani household, but it ended in shock, grief and disbelief for millions of South Africans. Chris Hani went out to buy newspapers after giving his bodyguards the day off. As he stepped out of his car, gunman Janus Walus took aim with an evil intent. Moments later, Chris Hani was lying dead in a pool of blood with a fatal bullet wound to the head.
Terra Blanche was leading the AWB contingent.
It's like they're invading the place. Oh, look at it! They must shoot them. Big away. They must shoot them.
All of a sudden I saw the security people running out, and I said, "What's up?" And they said, they've broken through and they're coming. And then my own security man simply grabbed hold of me and ran.
So these two events are indicators that South Africa was descending into a wasteland of violence. The assassination of Chris Hani and the rise of the extreme right wing formed part of what was a rapidly expanding canvas, which was increasingly painted with planned and random acts of violence. South Africa witnessed a spiral of shootings, racially motivated attacks, bombings, people attacked on trains, necklacing, the increasing conflict between political formations between the ANC and Inkatha, which resulted in hostile and township warfare in the urban areas and armed clashes in the countryside. Attacks would be followed by counterattacks. And all of this added up to hundreds of lives being lost at Boipatong, Bishu, Crossroads, Fulweni, Katlehong, Leandra, KwaMadala, Pietermaritzburg, Sebokeng, St. James, Thokoza, Vosloorus. The list went on and on. So the seeds of sudden transformation, which we identified in the liberation movement narrative, which anticipated a popular seizure of power, ended up by germinating very differently. South Africans entered into negotiations to finalize the transition to a constitutional democracy. And they did so at a time when global capital was growing stronger every day. And this resulted in a situation which limited negotiation space and which limited room to maneuver.